The candles in the Aldenmere dining room had been burning for 3 hours, and the light they cast was precisely the kind that flattered everyone except the woman sitting at the foot of the table, too far from the warmth to matter, and too visible to disappear. 30 guests had come to dinner that evening. Mira had counted them from her seat, the way she had learned to count things since she arrived at Aldenmere, measuring the world in small, reliable numbers because the larger ones had long since stopped behaving. 30 guests, 16 candles in the central candelabra, 4 footmen moving along the perimeter of the room with the smooth efficiency of men paid to remain invisible. And at the head of the table, Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Aldenmere, 31 years old, and still as a figure cut from stone, watching the room with eyes that gave away nothing, and a jaw that might have been quarried from the same gray limestone as the house itself. She had been his wife for 6 weeks. What she did not yet know, seated at the foot of that table in her plain silk gown, while the diamonds of 3 titled women caught the candlelight around her, was that the evening would not end the way Lady Dorothea Whitmore had planned it. What she could not have predicted was that the single act she was about to commit, the act that would break the contract she had signed in her father's solicitor's cramped Holborn office on a gray Tuesday in November, would not be spoken on her own behalf at all. It would be spoken for a child, but she was not there yet. First, she had to survive the soup course. Mira Ashworth had been 23 years old and in possession of very few options when the letter arrived from the Duke of Aldenmere's solicitor. Her father, Sir James Hartley, had died in October without a male heir, and the entail on Hartley Park had named a cousin in Shropshire as the next claimant. The estate would pass. The house would pass. Her mother and her younger sister would have approximately 4 months before the new claimant took possession, which was long enough to find smaller lodgings in Bath and not long enough to find them comfortable ones. Mira herself had been conducting quiet inquiries about a post as a governess, because a governess's post was the only respectable form of employment available to a woman of her education and reduced means, and she had been doing this with the calm of someone who has already grieved the future she expected and is now making peace with the one that remains. The solicitor's letter changed the mathematics, though it did not change the fundamental transaction. The Duke of Aldenmere required a wife. His late wife, Helena, had died in childbed 3 years prior, leaving behind one son, Thomas, now 8 years old, and growing up in a house that had decided, collectively, to speak as little as possible about her. The Duke required a wife who would be a legal and social presence at Aldenmere, who would provide stability for his heir's household, and who would abide by a single condition that the solicitor had described in the letter as a private domestic arrangement. The condition was this: she would not speak in public settings without his express permission or in response to a direct address from him. In company, at dinners, at assemblies, during calls, she would maintain a considered silence. The solicitor had written the word considered, as though it were a kindness, as though a silence with an adjective before it were less of a cage than one without. Mira had read the letter twice at the writing desk in her father's study, her father's pen still in its holder, her father's letter opener lying across the blotter where he had left it on the last morning he was well enough to use it. She had read the condition a 3rd time. Then she had folded the letter, placed it inside the drawer of the desk, and gone downstairs to tell her mother that they would not need the lodgings in Bath. She arrived at Aldenmere on a Wednesday in late November, in a hired carriage with 2 trunks and a writing case that had been her father's, because she had decided she would at least keep something that was his. The house came into view through the carriage window as the vehicle rounded the last bend in the drive, and Mira had pressed one gloved hand flat against the cold glass and looked at it without flinching. Aldenmere was gray and enormous and symmetrical in the way of houses that have been designed to convey permanence rather than welcome. its stone the color of pewter in the November light, its windows reflecting the sky rather than admitting it. Edmund was waiting in the entrance hall. Not in the formal receiving room, not at the foot of the steps, but in the entrance hall itself, standing at the edge of the checkered marble floor with his hands clasped behind his back, and his face composed into the particular expression she would come to recognize as his public face, the one that communicated nothing beyond the fact that he was present and observing. He was taller than she had imagined from the solicitor's description. His hair was dark, gray threaded at the temples in a way that seemed premature for 31 years, and his eyes, when they met hers across the hall, were the precise color of smoke over still water. He had said, very correctly, "Miss Hartley, welcome to Aldenmere." And then he had introduced her to Mrs. Arden, the housekeeper, a compact woman of 50-odd years with a face built for endurance and hands that were always moving, and to Thomas, who stood beside the housekeeper like a sentry at his post, small and contained and fiercely careful, the way children are when they have decided that the world requires careful management. Thomas had looked at her with eyes too much like his father's, and Mira had crouched down, which was not perhaps what a new duchess was expected to do in her first moments at her husband's estate, and said very quietly that he must be Thomas, and that she had heard there was a library here worth admiring, and she wondered if he might show it to her before tea. She had said this before remembering the contract. Thomas had looked at her for a long moment, and then said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be composed, that yes, there was a library, and yes, he supposed he could show her. Edmund, who had been standing 8 feet away, had not spoken. He had turned slightly toward the window, and the line of his jaw had altered by something so slight she nearly did not see it, some small private adjustment that he had not intended to be visible. She had not known what to make of it, and had filed it away in the same careful part of her mind where she was filing all of him. If you have wondered about the nature of contracts made between desperate circumstances and cold necessities, leave a thought below. This story takes Mira's and holds it carefully to the light. The first weeks at Aldenmere were a lesson in the architecture of silence. The house itself was not quiet, exactly. It had its own sounds, the creak of the old staircases, the wind finding the gaps in the stone around the east wing windows, the distant rhythm of the stables and the kitchen below the main floors. But the upper rooms, the rooms where the family lived, carried a specific quality of restraint, as though everything in them were still waiting for permission to breathe. The portrait of the late Duchess hung at the top of the main staircase, turned at a slight angle so that a person climbing the stairs met only its edge, the gilded frame and a narrow strip of blue damask, never the face itself. Mira did not ask about it. She was learning the house through its silences as much as its rooms, understanding where the cold came from and where the warmth pooled, watching Edmund cross the entrance hall in the mornings on his way to the estate office, noting the way Thomas positioned himself near doorways as though he might need to leave quickly. She observed without speaking, which was, after all, what she had contracted to do. Edmund spoke to her in the mornings over the correspondence, short declarative sentences that were not unkind, but were carefully bounded. Questions about whether she required anything. Statements about the day's schedule. Once a brief explanation of the estate's tenancy arrangements that she suspected he had intended as information, but that landed in the quiet dining room with the autumn light coming in gray through the windows, as something closer to an offering. She had listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face attentive. And when he finished, she had nodded, and he had looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly required before returning to his letters. She had been addressed as Miss Hartley by every member of the household except Mrs. Arden, who called her Your Grace, with a warmth that suggested she had been waiting to call someone that for quite some time, and except Thomas, who called her nothing at all yet. Lady Dorothea Whitmore arrived on a Thursday in the third week of November, traveling from her own establishment in Berkshire in a carriage that was ostentatiously well appointed and accompanied by Cecily Vane, whose diamonds were, by any measure, inappropriate for a country visit. Lady Dorothea was 63 years old, still beautiful in the manner of women who have decided to remain so by force of will, and she entered Aldenmere as though she owned it, which she once had, in the only sense that mattered to her. She had chosen Edmund's first wife. She had expected to choose his second. At their introduction in the drawing-room, Lady Dorothea looked at Mira for precisely 4 seconds, the way one looks at an arrangement that has been placed where a better arrangement ought to be, and said, "My son has made a practical choice." She turned to Edmund without waiting for any response. "Cecily is looking very well this season, Edmund. You would have found her accomplished company." Mira sat with her teacup and kept her face neutral and filed that away too. Cecily Vane sat near the fire with the ease of someone who has been told her whole life that the best chair belongs to her. She was 22 years old, very handsome, and possessed of the particular confidence of women who have never been asked to doubt themselves on the grounds that the world found them agreeable. She glanced at Mira once across the drawing-room with an expression that registered nothing particular, which was itself a verdict. In Cecily's reckoning, the woman at the edge of the room was not a rival. She was a domestic arrangement. The distinction, Cecily's expression said clearly, required no further discussion. The witnessing came on a Monday afternoon, a week after Lady Dorothea's arrival, in the long corridor outside the drawing-room where Thomas was being conducted through his afternoon lessons by a tutor who had the day off and whose absence had resulted in a somewhat unsupervised hour. Mira had been passing through the corridor with a book she had taken from the library, not the famous library, which was on the ground floor and which she was still learning, but the smaller upstairs one that held the older volumes, when she heard Lady Dorothea's voice through the half-open drawing-room door, and heard, following it, Thomas's small silence, which was a different quality of silence than any other silence in the house. She opened the door. Lady Dorothea was standing in the center of the drawing-room. Thomas was standing near the writing desk, with one hand pressed flat on its surface, the way he stood near doorways, ready. Lady Dorothea was explaining to him, in the measured tones of someone conducting a correction, that a boy of his position did not leave his toys on the drawing-room floor, did not speak at dinner without being addressed, and would present himself in the schoolroom at 3:30, and not in the drawing-room at all, since his presence there served no purpose that she could identify. She said the last sentence without raising her voice, which made it worse. Mira stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She was aware, in the particular way she had become aware of things since signing the contract, that speaking now would constitute a breach of the private domestic arrangement. Lady Dorothea was technically company. The room was technically a public setting within the household. She was aware of all of this, with the clear-sighted calm of a woman who has already done the accounting and found that some costs are worth bearing. She said, "Thomas, I have been looking for you. I wanted to show you a passage in the history I borrowed from the upstairs library. I think you would find the maps particularly interesting." She looked then at Lady Dorothea and held the look for a moment, steady and polite, and entirely without apology. "I hope we are not interrupting your afternoon, Lady Dorothea." Lady Dorothea's face performed a small recalibration. She said, in a voice that carried the faintest edge of something that wanted to be contempt but settled for displeasure, "I was not aware the arrangement extended to unsupervised involvement with the child. He is my husband's son. Mira said, "and I am his father's wife. I do not believe any other arrangement is required." Thomas looked at her. Something in his face, in the region of his eyes, changed very slightly. The way things change when a pressure that has been present long enough to seem permanent is briefly removed. She did not see Edmund in the doorway until they were leaving the room. He was standing in the corridor, still in his outdoor coat, having come in from the estate, and his face was doing what his face did when he was keeping it from doing anything else. He looked at her for a moment that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that he had heard. Then he stepped back and let them pass. And she took Thomas down the corridor toward the library and did not look back. That evening, Edmund came to the small sitting room where she spent her evenings reading and said without preamble, "You spoke in a private setting. The arrangement concerns company." She looked up from her book. "Yes." He stood in the doorway for a moment, his coat exchanged now for a dark evening coat, his hands at his sides. He said, "You were not wrong to do so." It was the most personal thing he had said to her since she arrived. He left before she could respond, and she sat for a long time with her book open in her lap and the fire burning down, turning over those 6 words. What she had not expected was Mrs. Arden. The housekeeper came to her the following morning while Mira was writing at the small desk in her sitting room, the one she had cleared of the room's previous occupant's ornaments to make space for her father's writing case. Mrs. Arden brought tea she had not requested and set it down with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has decided to say something and has organized the conversation around a practical act so that it does not feel like an imposition. She said, after the tea was set and the tray arranged and all the reasonable excuses for delay exhausted, "His Grace has not permitted himself to be disturbed since the late Duchess passed. 3 years, Your Grace. 3 years of this house keeping itself very quiet." She straightened the teacup. Her Grace Helena had a particular way of filling a room with her voice. After she was gone, I think the sound of it was in every corner for a long time. She paused. He blamed himself, you understand. For the child. For insisting on an heir when she was not strong. He has not said so. But a person who has managed a household for 22 years learns to read the things that are not said. Mira set down her pen. "The silence arrangement," she said carefully, "was his way of keeping the rooms the way he needed them," Mrs. Arden said, with the equanimity of a woman who has thought about this for 3 years and arrived at a conclusion she could live with. Not cruelty. Grief. Doing what grief does when a man is not built to name it. Mira looked at her writing case, at the pen lying quiet across the page where she had stopped mid-sentence. She thought about Helena's portrait at the top of the stairs, turned away from the light. She thought about the silence clause in the solicitor's letter, the word considered, the way she had read it as a diminishment, and which she now understood as something more complicated than that, something made of a specific morning 3 years ago, and a man who had not known how to keep breathing in a house full of her absence, and had managed, in the only way available to him, by removing what he could. It did not make the contract just. She was clear on that. It did not make her situation less constrained, or less isolating, or less the product of a social machinery that had exchanged her circumstances for his necessity. She knew all of that. What it did was make him a person, the way grief always makes people into persons when you learn it correctly. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Arden," and meant it. Now, if you have stayed with this story and felt the weight of it settling, know that what comes next is the part the season always constructs for women who are quiet when they should be loud and loud, when it matters, at the only moment that counts. Lady Dorothea's dinner arrived in December, arranged with a precision that declared its purpose to anyone paying attention. The guest list had been compiled by Dorothea herself, presented to Edmund as a social obligation during the season's final fortnight, and approved by him with the distracted courtesy of a man whose attention was elsewhere. 30 guests. 4 tables arranged in the Aldenmere dining room with the full silver service and the second-best chandelier relit for the occasion. Cecily Vane placed at Edmund's right hand, which was not, technically, Mira's position, but which had been managed with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had been setting tables at Aldenmere for 30 years and knew exactly where to put things to produce the desired effect. Mira was placed at the foot of the table. She had dressed with care. Her gown was deep blue silk, the best she owned, retrimmed with cream lace that her mother had sent from Bath, with a note that said only that it had been her grandmother's, and she hoped it would serve. It served. It was not what Cecily Vane was wearing, which was ivory and gold, and constructed with the confidence of a woman who has an allowance for exactly this purpose, but it was honest, and Mira had decided, somewhere around the second week at Aldenmere, that honesty was the only currency she had left, and she intended to keep it. The dinner began correctly. The soup was consumed, the fish removed, the entrees presented by the 4 footmen with the synchronized gravity of men who understood that they were part of a performance and had dressed accordingly. The conversation at Mira's end of the table was conducted by a baronet's wife to her left and a retired admiral to her right, both of whom addressed her with the polite brevity reserved for persons whose position in the room has not been fully clarified. She listened and replied to direct addresses in single sentences, which was within the contract's parameters, and watched the upper end of the table where Cecily Vane was saying something that made the guests to her immediate left laugh, and where Edmund sat as still as the stone wall behind him, watching the room. He looked at her once, across the length of the table and the 16 candles between them. She could not have said what was in the look. She had not yet learned all of him. It was during the dessert course that Lady Dorothea chose her moment. She had been waiting for it with the patience of a woman who has orchestrated events often enough to know that patience is the operative virtue. She waited until the table was at its most attentive, until the side conversations had reached their natural pauses, until the room was doing what rooms do at a certain point in a well-managed dinner, turning to listen to the person with the most authority. Then she said, loudly enough for the table to hear, but pleasantly enough to maintain the fiction of private speech. Of course, the practical arrangement my son made earlier this season was perfectly sensible, given the circumstances. One needs a legal presence for the estate. I imagine the Hartley family found it quite convenient as well. The arrangement. The dismissive label dropped cleanly into the conversational current, the way a stone drops into water, the ripples moving outward before anyone quite registered the sound. The baronet's wife, to Mira's left, set down her dessert spoon. The admiral to her right reached for his glass. Mira kept her hands in her lap, and her face composed, and looked at the candles. Lady Dorothea continued, with the smooth confidence of someone whose script had never failed before. Cecily, you were saying earlier about the Edinburgh assembly rooms. Do tell the table. And Cecily began to speak, bright and fluent, drawing the table's attention upward and away, and Mira sat at the foot of the 30-person dinner in her retrimmed cream lace and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that this was the machinery at its most efficient. The arrangement. Said in a room full of witnesses, at a table set by a woman who had been setting it for 30 years, in a house she had arrived at 6 weeks ago, with 2 trunks and a writing case, and no reasonable expectation of anything beyond endurance. She looked at Thomas. Thomas was seated at a small table in the alcove to the room's left, the position for children at formal dinners, with his tutor beside him. He had been quiet and careful all evening, doing what 8 years of watching adults manage him had taught him to do, which was to occupy the smallest possible space and make no sound that invited response. He was doing it now, very steadily, his hands in his lap and his eyes on his plate, and his small shoulders arranged in the specific posture of a child who is keeping himself assembled by concentration alone. Lady Dorothea, her point delivered, her composure restored, turned in her chair with the peripheral attention of a woman making sure the whole room was arranged correctly, and her gaze found Thomas in the alcove. She said, to no one in particular, but loudly enough for the immediate table to hear, "The child ought not to be at table at all at this hour. Constance, do see that he is removed to the nursery." Constance, the nearest parlor maid, moved toward the alcove. Thomas's hands tightened in his lap. Mira was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. The room noticed 30 guests, 4 footmen, 1 parlor maid, and Edmund at the head of the table all registered the movement at once, the way a room registers any unexpected event at a quiet dinner, with a collective drawing of breath and a turning of faces. She said, in a voice that was level and clear and entirely without decoration, "Thomas stays. He was invited to his father's table, and he has conducted himself with more grace than the evening has asked of him. He stays." The room was very quiet. She was aware that she had just broken the contract. She was aware that her voice was the first unrequested public speech she had made in 6 weeks at Aldenmere, and that she had spent 6 weeks building the discipline to keep the contract, and that she had just surrendered it in front of 30 witnesses for an 8-year-old boy who was not even her child. She was aware of all of this with a clear and settled certainty that felt nothing like regret. Lady Dorothea's face performed several rapid calculations. She said in a voice that had gone very precise, "I see the arrangement has not been well understood." "I understand it completely," Mira said. "Thomas stays." Into that silence came the sound of a chair being moved at the head of the table. Edmund rose. He did not speak immediately. He stood at the head of the table for a moment that lasted long enough for every person in the room to understand that something was happening which the evening had not planned for. And then he walked. 3 strides down the length of the room, past the candelabra and the silver service, and the seated figures of 30 guests who had come to a dinner and were now witnesses to something that none of them had been told to expect. 3 strides, and he was standing at Mira's side, and the room was holding its breath in the manner of rooms that have decided, collectively, to pay very close attention. He said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the dining room without being raised, "This is my wife." 4 words. They landed in the room the way the first note of an instrument lands in a large space, finding the walls and returning altered, filling the silence that preceded them. He said, "She is the Duchess of Aldenmere, and she has spoken correctly on every count, and Thomas will remain at table." He looked at his mother then, and the look was not unkind, but it was a door closing. "I believe we have detained our guests from their dessert." Lady Dorothea's face, in the single brief moment before it recovered its composure, showed the precise expression of someone whose confidence has rested on a premise that has just been removed. Cecily Vane, at the head of the table to Edmund's vacant chair, looked once at Edmund and once at Mira, and then looked down at her dessert with the specific attention of a woman deciding, sensibly, that she has somewhere better to be, and will arrange to be there shortly. The baronet's wife, to Mira's left, picked up her dessert spoon. The admiral to her right said, "To no one in particular." "Extraordinary evening." He meant it as approval. The word found its way down the table. Edmund remained beside her for a moment that was not required by social logic, standing close enough that she could see the gray threading at his temple and the slight alteration in the set of his jaw that she had been cataloging since November, and which she now understood. He said very quietly, so that only she could hear, "I should not have permitted the arrangement to stand as long as it did." she said equally quietly. You were managing something real. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face, the disciplined surface of it, shifted in a way that was not performance and not management, something she did not have a word for yet. He said, Yes. He returned to his chair. The dinner continued. Thomas, in his alcove, looked across at Mira with eyes that were too much like his father's and held a new expression in them, something careful and surprised and cautiously, tentatively, warm. The guests departed by 11. Lady Dorothea retired without speaking to Mira further, though as she passed the doorway of the drawing room where the ladies had gathered after dinner, she paused for a fraction of a second, and her face, in that fraction, made a small movement that Mira catalogued as recognition. The recognition of a woman who has understood, at last, that the room has been rearranged, and that the arrangement is not going back. Cecily Vane made her farewells with elegant brevity and a genuine warmth toward Edmund that had the grace to carry no expectation. And if that represented the best of her, then perhaps the best of her was worth acknowledging. And Mira found, to her mild surprise, that she could acknowledge it. Mrs. Arden supervised the clearing of the dining room and found a moment, in the passage outside the kitchen, to press Mira's hand once, briefly, with both of hers, which was not a thing she did as a general practice, and which communicated, in that brief pressure, everything that the evening's events required said, and that she was not going to say aloud. Edmund found Mira in the corridor outside the library at 11:15. She had gone there without quite intending to, drawn by the same instinct that brought her to the small upstairs library in the early mornings, the instinct toward the company of pages and the particular silence of rooms that hold the accumulated thinking of the dead. She was standing in the open doorway with her hand on the frame, not quite inside, when she heard him behind her. He said, I owe you an account of myself. She turned. He stood in the corridor with his coat still on, the way he sometimes arrived from the estate, the outdoor cold still about him, and he looked at her with the particular honesty of a man who has been rehearsing what he wants to say, and has decided, finally, to say it without rehearsal. He said, Helena died in March, 3 years ago. She was not strong, and I knew she was not strong, and I pressed for an heir regardless, because the estate required it, and because I was 30 years old, and did not yet understand that the things the estate requires and the things a person requires are not always reconcilable. He said this in the level tone he used for estate business, but the evenness of it was the evenness of something held in long control rather than of something felt lightly. Afterward, this house was full of her. Her voice particularly. I could not move through a room without it. The silence arrangement was. He paused. It was not a considered judgment about your worth. It was a man managing a wound by the only method he had available. Mira looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was lit by a single wall sconce, the light warm and unsteady in the draught from the east wing windows. She said, I know. Mrs. Arden told me what she could, and I have had 6 weeks of watching you manage it yourself. He said, you should not have had to live inside a contract made by grief. No, she said, I should not. But I should also tell you that the silence taught me to read this house, and this house has things in it worth reading. She looked past him for a moment, toward the staircase, toward the portrait's frame at the top of it, and then back. Helena's portrait at the top of the stairs. You have it turned. Yes, he said. I think, Mira said carefully, that a portrait turned away is still a presence. Perhaps more so. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yes, I have thought that myself. He looked at the library doorway behind her. May I show you something? She moved aside, and he passed into the library, and she followed him. The library at Aldenmere was everything Mrs. Arden had suggested, and Thomas had promised on that first Wednesday in November. Now, it was a long room with tall shelves running to a ceiling that required a rolling ladder, and a fireplace at the southern end large enough to warm the space properly, and 2 wing chairs arranged before it that showed the particular wear of chairs that have been sat in for 30 years by people who intended to sit for only 20 minutes and stayed the hour. A fire was laid and burning, low and steady, throwing its warm light across the old spines and the reading table and the worn turkey rug. On the wall between the 2 windows, facing the fireplace, hung a portrait of a young woman in a blue dress. She had dark eyes and a composed expression, and the particular quality of stillness in her painted face that good portraiture sometimes achieves. The sense that the person was at rest in themselves. It was Helena. Mira understood immediately. A smaller portrait than the one at the top of the stairs. Less formal, painted in what looked like this very room. The portrait was facing the room. "I turned it this morning," Edmund said behind her. "I had been thinking of it since September. I could not have told you why it became possible now, rather than then." Mira looked at the portrait for a moment, and said nothing, because some things are said better in their own quiet. Edmund moved to the fire and set another log from the basket, and the fire took it with the unhurried acceptance of a fire that has been burning long enough to know its business. He looked at her across the room, and the look was different from any that had preceded it, stripped of the management and the careful neutrality. The smoke-gray eyes carrying something direct and somewhat unguarded, and more like a question than anything he had ever asked her directly. He said, "I should like to know your opinion on a great many things." She looked at him across the firelit library, with the portrait of Helena in its proper place on the wall, and the fire steady in the grate, and the first snow of December beginning to fall, quite quietly, against the windows of Aldenmere. She said, "Then you will have to be prepared for a considered woman, Your Grace." He said, "Edmund." She said, "Edmund." The word had a different quality in her mouth than any title had possessed. It had the quality of something arrived at rather than assigned. He smiled. Not the managed expression she had catalogued across 6 weeks. Not the public face composed for the entrance hall and the dining room and the morning correspondence, but a real smile, brief and slightly unguarded, that transformed his face with the abruptness of a door opening onto an unexpected room. It was, Mira would think later, the moment she understood that the winter at Aldenmere was going to be worth the November that had preceded it. Thomas was asleep on the hearthrug when they came in from the corridor, wrapped in his own arms the way children sleep when they have fallen asleep somewhere other than bed, and the body has made its own arrangements. He had come down to the library after the last guest departed and fallen asleep over a history book with his cheek on his hand. And neither Edmund nor Mira moved to wake him. Mrs. Arden appeared in the doorway at 11:30 with a blanket and the expression of a woman who has managed this household long enough to know that some events in it are better left to proceed without intervention. She laid the blanket over Thomas with the practiced quiet of long practice, looked at Mira and Edmund standing together in the firelight, and withdrew with the tact of 22 years' service rendered visible in a single movement. Outside the tall library windows, the first snow of December was falling. It fell without sound or urgency, the way the first snow of a season always falls, slowly enough to seem deliberate, covering the gray stone of Aldenmere and the formal gardens and the long drive with the even thoroughness of a world deciding to begin again. Edmund stood beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the winter air, and looked at the snow. He said very quietly, the way the very quiet things are said in rooms where someone is sleeping, "Stay." It was not the word she had expected, and it carried in it nothing of commands or contracts or practical arrangements. It carried the weight of a man who had spent 3 years managing his own loss with great discipline and had discovered, over the course of 6 weeks and 1 dinner and a portrait turned to face the room, that the discipline had been costing him something he had not fully priced. She said, equally quietly, "I am not going anywhere." Thomas slept on the hearthrug with his cheek on his hand and his arms folded in their own warmth. The fire burned in the grate with the patience of a fire that has all night. Helena's portrait looked out from between the windows, composed and still, and finally in its proper place. The snow fell on Aldenmere with the quiet authority of all first things. The house breathed. If this story moved you, leave a word below about the moment that stayed with you longest. There are more stories waiting for you here, told with the same care, and every one of them is for you.